On Halloween night, a husband stepped out for 15 minutes to buy candy for the neighborhood children. When he came back, the front door was open. What he found inside was something that would haunt the responding officers for years. Some of them later sought psychological counseling. Veteran detectives who had worked violent crime for decades said they had never seen anything like what was inside that house. And at the center of it all, a woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to help people, who had survived unimaginable grief, who was 9 months pregnant and had just walked her daughter home from trick-or-treating. This is the story of Doreen Erbert and the man who put on a mask to end her life. Doreen Erbert was born on November 29, 1952, in California, one of 5 children in a large and close-knit family. From the time she was young, the people around her described the same qualities: warmth, a genuine desire to be useful, a personality that oriented itself toward other people's needs almost instinctively. Those qualities shaped the professional path she chose. After finishing her education, Doreen relocated to San Francisco and began working as a physiotherapist, a career that placed her directly in service of people who were hurting, helping them rebuild strength and function after injury or illness. It was exactly the kind of work her nature had always been pointing her toward. She also carried a personal dream alongside her professional one. She wanted a family, a big one, the kind she had grown up in. At 24, that dream seemed to be beginning. She met a man named Michael Venice through his work near her clinic. They began dating. Within months they were married, and in 1976, their son Paul was born. The early happiness between them didn't last. After Paul's birth, the relationship between Doreen and Michael began to fracture. Within a year, they divorced. Paul stayed with Doreen. Michael was given regular access. On the surface, it appeared to be a relatively functional separation. A year later, Doreen met a man named Charles. They married. They moved to San Jose, settling into a quiet residential neighborhood. In 1979, their daughter Diana was born. Charles embraced Doreen's son as his own. The family appeared to be finding its footing. Then February 1980 arrived. 4-year-old Paul climbed over the fence surrounding the family's backyard pool and fell into the water. Doreen was home. By the time she realized what had happened and pulled him out, critical time had passed. She called for an ambulance. Paul was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. For 10 days, Doreen sat at the edge of the worst possible outcome. Then the doctors delivered the conclusion she had been dreading. There was no path forward. The decision was made to discontinue life support. The investigation that followed cleared Doreen of any wrongdoing. The death was ruled a tragic accident. But clearing someone legally and clearing them internally are entirely different things. Doreen blamed herself in ways that the police report could not address. She kept moving because Diana needed her to. Her daughter became the reason she got up each morning. And slowly, across the following years, Doreen found her way back toward the future she had always wanted. 4 years after Paul died, she and Charles were expecting again. They had tried and lost 2 pregnancies in that period, both ending before term. This time, the pregnancy was progressing. A boy, due in early November. Life was returning. It was a Halloween like any other on their street. Neighbors had put up decorations. Porch lights were on. Children in costumes moved up and down the sidewalks in groups, paper bags and plastic pumpkins filling up with candy. It was the kind of evening that feels completely safe, precisely because it is familiar. Diana was 4 years old, and she wanted desperately to go. Her parents could not say no. Doreen, 9 months pregnant, days from her due date, walked the neighborhood with her daughter while Charles stayed home to hand out candy to the children who came to their door. They returned home shortly before 9 p.m. Charles checked the candy supply and found it was nearly gone. He didn't want to turn away any remaining children in the neighborhood, so he decided to make a quick run to the nearest store. He left around 8:50 p.m. He was gone approximately 15 minutes. When he turned back onto his street and approached the house, something was immediately wrong. The front door was standing open, not wide open, but slightly ajar in the way a door only stands when someone has left in a hurry or when something has happened to prevent it from closing properly. Charles went inside. What he found was beyond anything his mind had prepared him for. Doreen was on the floor of the corridor, motionless, surrounded by a quantity of blood that immediately made clear no one could survive that kind of loss. She showed no signs of life. Charles called 911 immediately. Then he saw the living room, the body of their unborn child, and beside the child, a human hand. Doreen's hand. Charles understood in that moment, with terrible clarity, that this was not a medical event. Someone had done this. Someone had come into his home in the 15 minutes he was away and done this to his family. His mind went to Diana. He began moving through the house, calling for her, slipping on blood as he ran. There was blood on the floor, blood on the walls, blood on the ceiling. He fell. He kept moving. He found her behind the sofa, alive, hiding, silent. When paramedics arrived, they detected a faint pulse in Doreen. They worked quickly and got her out of the house. But she died in the ambulance before reaching the hospital. Her son, whom they had chosen to name and were days away from welcoming, did not survive either. The medical examiner's examination of Doreen's body revealed the cause of her injuries. She had been struck repeatedly with a long, heavy-bladed instrument consistent with a sword or machete. The wounds were extensive and deliberate. Before we continue, if this is your first time here, Unresolved Years Mysteries covers cases like this one with the full weight they deserve. Not just the crime, but the person at the center of it. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming in this case, and everyone that follows. The officers who worked the scene that Halloween night described it in terms that stayed with them for years afterward. Several later sought professional psychological support. The sheer scale of the violence inside that otherwise ordinary home was something even experienced. Investigators said they had not encountered before. A systematic examination of the exterior produced two initial pieces of evidence. On the sidewalk outside, investigators found a trail of bloody footprints. The trail moved away from the house and stopped abruptly in the middle of the road, suggesting the person responsible had gotten into a waiting vehicle at that point and driven away. The prints indicated a specific shoe size and sole pattern that would later become significant. On the front lawn, they found a wolf mask. It was covered in blood. Charles confirmed the mask did not belong to his family. It had never been in that house. It had been left behind by the person who came to the door. The evidence was sent to the laboratory. Then detectives turned to the one person who had seen what happened. Diana. She was 4 years old, and she was in shock. But she was the only witness. Carefully over time, investigators gathered what she could offer. What she described was this. Shortly after her father left for the store, someone knocked on the door. Doreen answered it. A man in a wolf mask was standing there, holding a long-bladed weapon. He told her, directly, in words Diana could recall, that he was going to kill her. Doreen screamed at Diana to run. Diana ran and hid behind the sofa. She did not emerge until her father found her. She could not describe the man's face. The mask had hidden it entirely. Investigators initially gave serious consideration to Charles as a potential suspect. The timing of his departure from the house lined up uncomfortably with the arrival of the attacker. Doreen had been attacked in the window he was away. When he returned, he had come into contact with blood throughout the house. He had slipped and fallen in it. Police had to consider whether any of that contact was deliberate. But the theory broke down quickly under scrutiny. The bloody footprints outside did not match Charles's shoes. No blood was found in his vehicle. No second pair of shoes was discovered that might explain the discrepancy. The store he went to was confirmed by staff, by the transaction itself, and by surveillance footage. He had purchased candy and returned within the time frame he described, leaving no window for involvement. Charles was cleared as a suspect. Then detectives asked him a question they always ask when the obvious answer has been ruled out. Was there anyone in Doreen's life who might want to harm her? Charles answered immediately. Michael Venice, Doreen's first husband. According to Charles, the relationship between Michael and Doreen had been superficially manageable for years after the divorce. That changed after Paul's death. Michael had never accepted the conclusion of the police investigation. He blamed Doreen directly, believing she had been deliberately negligent. He had filed a civil lawsuit against her to establish legal responsibility for the boy's death. He lost. The animosity, rather than diminishing after the court outcome, intensified. Michael Venice had a history that Charles was able to describe in some detail. From early childhood, Michael had a significant hearing impairment that required him to wear a hearing aid, in an era when such devices were considerably larger and more conspicuous than they are today. He had been teased persistently by other children because of it. He grew up largely isolated, introverted, with few close relationships and significant difficulty forming connections with other people, particularly women. Meeting Doreen had appeared to change some of that, but the old patterns had never fully resolved. After Paul's birth, Michael had withdrawn from Doreen, from the child, into depressions that Doreen attributed to unresolved childhood wounds. It was one of the factors that led to the divorce. When Doreen married Charles, and Charles became part of Paul's life, Michael's resentment deepened. He experienced it as displacement. Paul's death, rather than creating any kind of shared grief between Michael and Doreen, became instead a source of accusation and rage. In Michael's framing, Doreen had taken everything from him, and now he had nothing. He had also recently lost the job he had held for most of his adult working life. Detectives drove to Michael's address, 2 miles from the crime scene, just after midnight. His pickup truck was parked near the garage. When an officer shone a flashlight into the cab, something on the steering wheel and the keys caught the light. It looked like blood. They knocked on the door. No answer. The lights inside were on. Through the door, they could hear water running. They kept knocking. Michael eventually opened the door. He was calm, composed in a way that the investigators would later describe as notably flat for a man who had just been told his ex-wife had been murdered. He answered their questions without visible emotion. He said he had gone to the store during the day, come home, and not left since. He had no explanation for why there appeared to be blood on his steering wheel. When officers asked to come inside, he agreed, without a warrant. He even agreed to sign voluntary consent forms to authorize a search of the property. As he reached for the pen, an investigator noticed his right hand. There was a deep cut, fresh, still bleeding. Michael said he had injured himself earlier that day while carving a pumpkin. The investigators said nothing, but they noted it. One officer accompanied Michael upstairs to retrieve identification. When they entered the bedroom, Michael moved toward the headboard of his bed. The officer told him to step aside. Behind the headboard, hanging from a holster, a loaded firearm. Downstairs, other officers following drops of blood across the floor reached the garage, a washing machine, and beside it, a pile of clothing with visible blood staining. That was sufficient. Michael Venice was placed under arrest. Once he was in custody, investigators returned to the house with forensic personnel for a thorough examination. What they found went far beyond what was needed to establish he had been at the crime scene. In the house, they found an empty box for a machete with an 18-inch blade. The medical examiner had confirmed that a weapon matching exactly those specifications was consistent with the injuries inflicted on Doreen. The box was empty. They also found 2 handmade coffin-shaped objects, and body bags of the kind typically associated with medical or mortuary use, items Michael had no professional reason to possess. Taken together, what investigators were looking at was not the aftermath of a spontaneous breakdown. It was what appeared to be a plan that had included a means of disposal. The prosecution would later argue that Michael had intended to kill both Doreen and Charles and remove their bodies, and that something, possibly panic, possibly fear of being caught, had caused him to abandon the second half of that plan. Despite all of this, the judge reviewing the initial arrest warrant application found the evidence too circumstantial to authorize extended detention. Michael was released. 3 days later, the laboratory results arrived. Stay with this, because what the lab found, and what happened next at trial, is where this case becomes something that has stayed with the people who worked it for the rest of their lives. If you want cases like this told in full, subscribe to Unresolved Years Mysteries. We don't stop at the headline. Forensic analysts had identified 2 distinct blood types at the crime scene. The majority of the blood present matched Doreen's type. A smaller quantity matched a different profile, one that did not belong to Doreen or Charles. It matched Michael's blood type. The cut on his hand had not come from a pumpkin. It appeared he had injured himself during the attack. He had blood at the scene. This time, the judge issued the arrest warrant without hesitation. Michael Venice was taken back into custody and formally charged with the murder of Doreen Erbert and her unborn child. Additional investigation continued in parallel. Detectives spoke to people who knew Michael. Several confirmed that he had spoken openly in the period before the murder about his desire to kill Doreen and Charles and dispose of their bodies. When that statement was combined with the coffins and body bags found in his house, the picture of a premeditated plan became considerably clearer. Investigators also canvassed Doreen's neighborhood, speaking with families who had been out trick-or-treating that evening. Children who had been going door to door reported seeing an adult man wearing a wolf mask standing across the street from Doreen's house, watching it. They had noticed him around 7 p.m., approximately 2 hours before the murder. And Michael's social circle confirmed something else. The previous Halloween, he had worn a wolf mask to a party. Investigators found a photograph of him wearing it. They found the clothing he had worn in that photograph still at his house. The mask recovered from Doreen's lawn was the same type as the one in the photograph. Michael Venice's trial began in July 1988, nearly 4 years after the murders. It lasted approximately 1 year. His initial plea was guilty. He later changed it. He did not deny committing the murders. His defense rested on a different argument, that he was not legally responsible for his actions because of his mental state at the time. A psychologist retained to evaluate him concluded that Michael had serious psychological difficulties. Michael's own account of that night, provided to the evaluator, was this: seeing the Halloween celebrations, the children in costumes, the joy, the families moving through the neighborhood together triggered memories of Paul, of the child he had lost, of the woman he blamed for that loss. Something inside him, he said, broke. He went to Doreen's house with the machete. When she opened the door and recognized the man behind the mask, she screamed at Diana to run. And Michael attacked her. He claimed he had not known she was pregnant. The prosecution challenged that claim directly. Doreen's friends testified that her pregnancy at 9 months had been impossible to miss. They described her condition in terms that made any claim of ignorance difficult to sustain. The prosecution's argument was straightforward. This was not a mental breakdown. This was a plan. He had told people he intended to kill them. He had acquired a weapon. He had prepared a mask for concealment. He had positioned himself across the street 2 hours in advance and waited. He had constructed a means of body disposal in his home. He had executed the plan when the window appeared. Diana testified. She was 9 years old by the time the trial reached that point. Charles had not wanted her to have to do it. She was the only living witness. She testified to what she had seen and heard on the night of October 31st, 1984. A man in a wolf mask at the door. A long bladed weapon. Her mother telling her to run. The jury found Michael Venice guilty of the murder of Doreen Erbert and the murder of her unborn child. He was sentenced to death. California subsequently imposed a moratorium on the execution of death sentences, while the legal framework for capital punishment underwent review. The moratorium has never been lifted in a way that changed Michael's situations. As of the most recent available information, he remains incarcerated. His sentence has not been carried out. The case closed in the courtroom. It did not close for the people who lived through it. Diana grew up with the memory of that Halloween night as a permanent fixture in her life. She has spoken about how it followed her, not periodically, not in difficult moments, but constantly. As a shadow that never fully lifted. She described the struggle to function while carrying something that heavy across decades. Eventually, she made a decision that she later described as necessary for her own survival. She chose to forgive Michael, not for him, for herself. She said she made that choice because she recognized that without it, the horror of that night would consume whatever remained of her life. She could not go on carrying it the way she had been. Doreen Erbert was a physiotherapist who spent her career helping people rebuild after injury. She was a mother who survived the drowning death of her first child and found the strength to keep going. She was 9 months pregnant and walking her 4-year-old daughter home from trick-or-treating on the last night of her life. She opened her front door, recognized the man behind the mask, and screamed at Diana to run. Her daughter ran. Her daughter survived. Her daughter grew up. Doreen did not get to see any of it. This is the kind of case Unresolved Years Mysteries exists to cover in full, not just the crime, but the person. Doreen Erbert deserves to be remembered as more than a Halloween murder case. She was a complete human being who spent her life in service of other people. If this episode gave you something, subscribe and share it. Every view is another person who now knows her name.